Do not dare turn the page unless you are ready to learn what monstrous hatred hid behind the dazzling smiles of the last century's greatest idols. These 10 titans of Hollywood regarded British actors as a virus and waged open war against them on set, driving colleagues to nervous breakdowns and into oblivion. They trailed behind them a wake of shattered careers, courted the tabloids with quiet bribes, and reveled in their power while their victims drowned their grief in whiskey. And the final story will truly leave you stunned. A legendary actress who spent years tormenting a young British starlet, pushing her to the brink of madness and never once attempting an apology before death closed the curtain. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which of these stellar monsters shocked you most.
Humphrey Bogart versus Leslie Howard. Today, Humphrey Bogart is more than a name. He's a symbol of unshakable masculine cool, eternal cynicism, and that smoke-roughened voice that became the gold standard of film noir. But in the 1930s, he was just one of hundreds of second-tier actors shuffled through bit parts as gangsters and washed-up drifters by indifferent studio bosses. His path to Olympus was blocked by a man whose very presence felt like a provocation, Leslie Howard. Howard embodied everything a certain breed of American in that era viewed with suspicion. He was refined, educated, aristocratic, and possessed that impeccable British accent that seemed to unlock every door in Hollywood's upper circles. To Bogart, who believed in sweat, grit, and the honest authority of his fists, Howard represented a system where lineage outweighed talent and polish passed for substance. Their clash began on the Broadway stage in The Petrified Forest. Howard played the brooding intellectual, Bogart the escaped killer, Duke Mantee. Bogart loathed the way Howard carried himself behind the curtain. The Englishman sipped tea, discoursed on high art, and regarded his American colleagues with a faint, almost imperceptible condescension that nevertheless burned. Humphrey dismissed Howard's style as limp and overly delicate, scoffing openly at what he saw as his reluctance to get his hands dirty, even in character. When it came time to adapt the play for the screen at Warner Bros., the studio considered replacing Bogart with the more established Edward G. Robinson. Howard intervened. He issued an ultimatum. Either Bogart played Mantee or he would walk away. By all logic, Bogart should have been grateful. Instead, the gesture stoked the embers of his resentment. He hated the idea that his future depended on the whim of that starched Englishman. On set, Bogart leaned deliberately into his rough edges, sharpening them against Howard's elegance. It infuriated him that Howard seemed effortlessly lit, as though the camera loved him by default, while Bogart had to claw for every inch of screen time with sheer, brooding force. To Bogart, the British invasion of Hollywood was a kind of contagion, diluting raw American vitality with theatrical flourishes and cultivated airs. Even after the film made him a star, the bitterness lingered like a taste he could not wash away. He mockingly referred to Howard as a pink petal and insisted that British actors relied on their accents as parlor tricks to disguise a lack of backbone. This was more than a quarrel between two performers. It was a collision of worlds, old Europe with its inherited poise and new America with its restless fury. Bogart refused, to the end of his life, to acknowledge Howard's role in shaping his career. He preferred to believe he had succeeded in spite of British influence, not because of it. Whenever a script called for a character with polished English manners, his jaw would tighten, and the memory of Leslie Howard would rise like a wall between him and the crown he felt he had earned. In Bogart's mind, Howard remained that cool Englishman gazing down from a penthouse window, while he himself swallowed the dust of the streets below. Even Howard's tragic death during the Second World War did little to soften his view. Bogart continued to regard the British icon as little more than a gleaming wrapper, impressive at first glance but hollow at the core. Nothing like the raw, imperfect, and fiercely alive cinema he believed he was born to defend.
Joan Crawford versus Vivien Leigh. Joan Crawford was not merely an actress, she was a steel structure raised on a foundation of ambition, ruthless discipline, and a near-manic need to control everything within a mile's reach. She had clawed her way out of poverty and built herself into the image of an unbreakable woman, a granite figure towering over Hollywood. By the end of the 1930s, she sincerely believed the Dream Factory was her private domain. Then, in 1939, a fragile British actress stepped onto her territory, and for Crawford, it marked the beginning of a private hell. The intruder was Vivien Leigh, and the battlefield was the role of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, a role Joan considered hers by divine right. She was incandescent with rage. How dared this English rose, with her porcelain skin and finishing school manners, presume to embody the very essence of the American South? Joan, who was used to dragging an army of admirers in her wake and dictating terms to studios, suddenly found herself sidelined in the most talked-about casting call in cinematic history. She openly dismissed Vivien as a painted doll and a British absurdity, insisting the actress could never understand the passion and suffering of a Southern woman. Her veins run with iced English tea, not hot blood, Joan would sneer at parties, her voice sweet as poison. At every gathering where Leigh appeared, Crawford staged a performance of her own. She swathed herself in the heaviest furs, fastened the most blinding diamonds at her throat, and fixed her rival with a gaze sharp enough to scorch. She glittered as if determined to reduce the Briton to ashes on the spot. But Hollywood, ever ravenous for new faces, fell headlong in love with Vivien Leigh. What infuriated Joan most was that Leigh did not seem to fight for lighting or camera angles. The lens adored her instinctively. It caressed her features. Crawford, by contrast, constructed every shot like a military campaign, calculating shadows and poses with the precision of a general mapping out battle. The humiliation deepened when Leigh won an Academy Award for her very first major American role, while Crawford had spent years branded box office poison, waiting in vain for critical redemption. To Joan, it was a personal insult. The British newcomer had arrived, seized America's most coveted role, claimed its highest honor, and still managed to look like an innocent angel throughout. Crawford retaliated the only way she knew how, through whispers. She spread rumors about Vivien's mental instability and her scandalous affair with Laurence Olivier, hoping puritanical Hollywood would recoil from the outsider. In Joan's private taxonomy, British actresses were cold fish and hypocrites, stealing bread from honest American women while hiding behind their refined accents to disguise a lack of true fire. What she could not forgive was that her own grueling, sometimes brutal labor was being eclipsed by what looked like effortless grace. In Vivien, Joan saw not just a rival, but a threat to her very archetype, the hard, commanding, razor-edged woman she had perfected on screen. Years later, when illness began to dim Vivien's brilliance, Joan still could not resist a barb. Her success, Joan would remark acidly, had been a fortunate accident granted to mediocrity. The words were as sharp as ever. This was a war for the right to be called the defining woman of an era, and Joan Crawford knew no mercy in war. She turned her hatred of Vivien Leigh into fuel, driving herself to work harder, fiercer, angrier, determined to prove that one true American bitch was worth a dozen British princesses. The walls of her mansion absorbed 1,000 curses hurled at that Englishwoman. They stood as silent witnesses to the moment when professional jealousy hardened into obsession, an obsession that devoured everything in its path.
Clark Gable versus Laurence Olivier.
Clark Gable was Hollywood's undisputed monarch, a man whose masculinity had been elevated to myth and whose charisma required no elaborate theatrical scaffolding. To him, acting was honest labor, no different from chopping wood or fixing an engine. You showed up, did the job, collected your paycheck, and remained a man. So when Laurence Olivier appeared on the Hollywood horizon, Gable felt more than professional rivalry. He felt a deep aesthetic and personal aversion. Olivier embodied everything the king despised about the British acting tradition: starched collars, Shakespearean grandeur, and an almost ornamental elegance that struck Gable as faintly effete. It infuriated him that Olivier carried the habits of the stage into cinema, treating every scene as if it were a soliloquy from Hamlet. Gable openly mocked him, calling him a misunderstanding in tights and a ballet actor in disguise, implying that a real man did not preen before a mirror in search of dramatic nuance. He trailed a string of barbed jokes about delicate British performers who could not play a simple scene without consulting a volume of the classics. The tension sharpened when Olivier began earning acclaim for roles demanding psychological depth, a quality Gable dismissed as indulgence. In his view, the American audience wanted a man who could throw a punch and kiss the girl, not a slender Englishman brooding over metaphysics. At studio gatherings, Gable made a point of ignoring Olivier. When he did address him, it was usually to jab at his suffocating English accent. What angered Gable most was Olivier's thinly veiled disdain for Hollywood. He treated it as a temporary stopover, a profitable detour, insisting that true art lived only on the London stage. To Gable, that was hypocrisy at its finest, pocketing American millions while looking down on the industry that paid them. Olivier, for his part, reportedly regarded Gable as a charming savage, a man of instinct without technique. That judgment only deepened the rift. Gable carried his irritation onto every set, demanding that his characters be stripped of any hint of British refinement. He leaned into his roughness, his American slang, his plain-spoken swagger, building a barricade of frontier values around himself. He would not forgive Olivier for making critics question whether Hollywood's style of acting was enough on its own. In Gable's eyes, Olivier was an emissary of high art, intent on turning cinema into a lecture hall of borrowed quotations. His hostility toward the British star became for him a defense of masculinity on screen, a quality he believed the English threatened to dilute with their sensitivity and polish. Whenever they found themselves in the same room, the air seemed to crackle. Gable did not hide his belief that Olivier was an upstart, hiding behind ornate monologues because he feared the vulnerability of simply being human. Their feud became backstage legend, a clash of philosophies in which Gable defended his throne to his last breath against the British king of the stage, whom he saw as nothing more than a powdered shadow of true greatness.
Bette Davis versus Olivia de Havilland. Bette Davis was never a woman to soften her words or smooth over sharp edges. Her career was forged in fury, raw nerves, and an almost frightening honesty before the camera. She became the emblem of American emotional intensity, a bulldog of an actress who would sink her teeth into a role and refuse to let go until she had drained every last drop of its soul. It was almost inevitable that her chosen adversary in Hollywood would be Olivia de Havilland, British-born, impeccably composed, and everything Davis instinctively mistrusted. Olivia embodied the English rose, flawless manners, a gentle voice, restraint polished to a mirror sheen, and that aristocratic courtesy which, to Bette, was merely hypocrisy dressed in silk. Davis openly referred to her as cotton candy filled with cyanide, convinced that behind the angelic face and downcast eyes lurked a calculating, cold-blooded woman.
What stoked her resentment further was the fact that de Havilland seemed to land roles that demanded refinement and moral grace, while Davis was so often handed the parts of hysterics and fallen women. It infuriated Bet that Olivier did not need to scream or smash china to command attention. She would simply enter a room and men would fall silent under the spell of her British elegance. To Davis, this felt like a direct affront to her own method, built on sweat, bruises, and open wounds. She dragged Olivier's name through the filthiest corners of the tabloids, mocking her voice as the squeak of a frightened mouse dreaming of cheese from another's trap. When award season placed them in competition for the same honors, the rivalry sharpened into open hostility. Bet dismissed her rival's composure as a cheap trick designed to manipulate critics. She was certain de Havilland used her Englishness as armor, hiding behind it to disguise what Bet believed was a lack of genuine fire. On the rare occasions their paths crossed on set, Davis launched psychological assaults with barely concealed delight. She would laugh loudly at Olivier's British pronunciation or toss off cutting remarks about her Puritan upbringing. For Bet, who believed in frontal attack, Olivier's quiet, intelligent mode of defense was unbearable. She saw her as a cunning cat that unsheathed its claws only when the prey was too weak to fight back. What enraged Davis most was the contradiction at the heart of her rival. Despite the image of sweetness, de Havilland possessed a spine of steel. In time, she would win crucial legal battles against the studios, reshaping the power dynamic in Hollywood. To Bet, this felt like a theft, not merely of victory, but of identity. She had long cultivated her own legend as the industry's chief rebel, and now this softly spoken Englishwoman had claimed the crown. Davis could not forgive the possibility that beneath the mask of virtue, Olivier had proven smarter and more strategic than she was. The feud endured for decades. Even after both women had ascended into legend, Bet continued to insist that Olivier was nothing more than a well-trained maid who had accidentally slipped into her mistress's gown. For Davis, de Havilland remained the embodiment of how British propriety could eclipse American passion. She carried that bitterness to the end of her days, refusing to admit that beneath Olivier's sugar glaze lay metal every bit as unyielding as her own.
John Wayne versus Richard Burton. John Wayne, known to the world as the Duke, was more than a movie star. He was a walking manifesto of traditional America, the living emblem of the Wild West and unbending conservative virtue. His life followed a strict code: loyalty to the flag, respect for physical strength, and iron discipline on set. That is why the arrival of Richard Burton in Hollywood felt to Wayne like a personal affront. Burton, a British intellectual with Welsh roots, embodied everything the Duke distrusted in the new generation of actors. He leaned left politically, wore his education like armor, and, most offensive of all in Wayne's eyes, lived as a notorious reveler, turning his existence into a traveling circus of drunken nights and headline-making affairs. Wayne openly referred to him as a drunken Welsh disaster and damned British pomposity, convinced that Burton was corrupting the very soul of the profession with his brazen conduct. It infuriated Wayne that Burton was celebrated as a towering genius, while sometimes arriving on set barely steady on his feet after another night lost to whiskey. For Wayne, who carried the weight of multi-million-dollar budgets and hundreds of crew members on his shoulders, such disregard bordered on betrayal. He could not understand why American audiences swooned over Burton.
To him, the famed velvety voice was nothing more than overrated growling, a flourish masking emptiness. The conflict deepened because Burton did little to conceal his own contempt for Wayne's cowboy style of acting. He regarded John as a narrow-minded reactionary, a man capable only of playing himself against different backdrops. When Burton's scandalous romance with Elizabeth Taylor began trailing across front pages, Wayne's patience snapped. He saw in that affair the collapse of the family values he had so fiercely defended on screen. Wayne even attempted to use his influence with major studios to limit Burton's presence in what he called real men's pictures, insisting that the Brit belonged in the dim theaters of London, not beneath the blazing sun of American prairies. At one rare backstage encounter, Wayne pointedly refused to shake Burton's hand, declaring he had no desire to soil himself on a man who respected neither his liver nor his country. Burton laughed in his face and called him a museum exhibit, a relic whose time had long since passed. Their feud was ideological at its core, a clash between two visions of masculinity. Wayne believed in the authority of the fist and the dignity of silence. Burton believed in the power of language and the emotional thunder of Shakespeare. Watching Burton trail flocks of reporters behind him, Wayne felt that the classical Hollywood he had helped build over decades was crumbling beneath a new, unruly British wave. Until his final days, he could not forgive Burton for turning the actor's craft into a spectacle where personal scandal overshadowed mastery. To Wayne, Richard Burton remained the emblem of decline, an outsider who entered his house only to drain the wine cellar and shatter the sacred heirlooms. Even when Burton earned Academy Award nominations, Wayne would remark acidly that trophies were now handed out for the number of empty bottles in a dressing room. It was a battle of Arras, and the Duke defended his Wild West to the last bullet against the raids of a Welsh rebel.
Marilyn Monroe versus Laurence Olivier. Marilyn Monroe was America's ultimate dream, a woman fashioned from light, platinum, and a childlike vulnerability. Yet behind that luminous facade burned a desperate need to prove she was more than a dumb blonde, that she was a serious actress with a soul that ran deep. In 1956, she took what she believed would be a defining risk, joining forces with Laurence Olivier, the reigning god of the British stage and screen, to make The Prince and the Showgirl. Marilyn was certain the collaboration would grant her entry into the realm of high art. Instead, she collided with an iciness that nearly shattered her fragile confidence. The conflict ignited on the very first day of filming. Olivier, accustomed to iron discipline, flawless memorization, and the upright bearing of the theatre, was appalled by Monroe's working methods. She arrived with her acting coach, Paula Strasberg, in tow, whispering with her after every take, often disregarding instructions from Olivier, who was both her co-star and director. To him, acting was craft and technique, not public psychoanalysis. His British sensibility recoiled at the delays caused by what he saw as the American star's emotional whims. One day, patience spent, Olivier delivered a line that cut Marilyn to the bone. "Just be sexy and don't try to act." For Marilyn, who had spent her life fighting that very label, it felt like a slap across the face. She carried the insult through the remainder of the shoot, referring to Olivier as a starched snob without a heart, a smug, desiccated aristocrat. In him, she saw the embodiment of the elitism that had suffocated her for years. In her, he saw a marketing creation, undisciplined and technically unprepared. The animosity was mutual and palpable. The air inside the sound stages at Pinewood Studios seemed to crackle with tension. Olivier made little effort to hide his disdain. He mocked her devotion to method acting before the crew and pointedly glanced at his watch when she arrived late. To him, she was an unruly child stealing time from professionals. To her, his immaculate technique was mechanical posturing, polished, bloodless, devoid of truth. Marilyn carried her fears back to her dressing room, where she would lock herself inside and weep for hours, refusing to emerge until Olivier offered an apology he had no intention of giving. The British knight was convinced she manipulated him, wielding fragility as a form of power. She, meanwhile, simply could not function beneath the frost of his constant judgment. Their off-screen battle transformed the film into a monument to mutual resentment. In scene after scene, one could sense them straining to outdo each other, each armed with a radically different philosophy of performance. Marilyn would later describe Olivier as the cruelest man she had ever worked with, insisting his British perfectionism concealed a deeper misogyny and a disdain for spontaneity. Olivier, in his memoirs, conceded that Marilyn appeared luminous, almost genius on camera, but off camera she was a nightmare he would not wish on his worst enemy. For Marilyn, the experience was a painful lesson that the British crown did not bow to Hollywood glitter. For Olivier, it confirmed his suspicion that an American movie star could never truly belong to his sacred theatrical world. Their clash became a perfect emblem of the gulf between two cultures, the American pursuit of truth through vulnerability and pain, and the British devotion to form, discipline, and decorum. The hostility did not fade when production ended. Long afterward, Marilyn continued to carry the bruise of that collision, convinced that Olivier's aristocratic disdain had inflicted damage on her self-worth from which she never fully recovered.
Frank Sinatra versus Peter O'Toole. Frank Sinatra was a man accustomed to the world snapping into place at the flick of his fingers. He was the uncrowned king of Hollywood and Las Vegas, the leader of the Rat Pack, a figure whose rumored ties to mobsters and political heavyweights made him seem untouchable. Sinatra worshipped discipline, loyalty, and immaculate style. In his universe, everything was done his way or not at all. Then, in the early 1960s, Peter O'Toole burst onto the Hollywood scene, an Irishman with a distinctly British bearing whose explosive performance in Lawrence of Arabia turned him into an overnight sensation. O'Toole was Sinatra's opposite in every way. He was a wild, unruly intellectual who scorned Hollywood hierarchies and carried a reputation for being able to outdrink an entire regiment while reciting Shakespeare without missing a beat. Sinatra's hostility toward O'Toole ignited instantly, almost on a biological level. It infuriated Frank that this British upstart showed him not the slightest deference. While other actors flattered and hovered around Sinatra, hoping to be welcomed into his inner circle, O'Toole openly mocked his gangster airs and dismissed him as a singer for housewives with an inflated ego. Sinatra fired back in public, branding Peter a filthy British actor and an unwashed rebel, insisting that his behavior disgraced the industry. The feud escalated when their paths crossed in the elite bars of Los Angeles. Frank was used to being the dominant presence in any room, but O'Toole, armed with ferocious charisma and an almost supernatural tolerance for alcohol, drew every eye. Sinatra moved with an entourage of bodyguards meant to intimidate dissenters, yet O'Toole remained unimpressed. He would stroll up to Sinatra's table and toss out a razor-edged remark about his height or his hairpiece, driving Frank into a silent fury. What stung most was that O'Toole drank harder, laughed louder, and still retained the aura of a serious actor, while critics often accused Sinatra of repeating himself. At one private party, matters nearly came to blows after O'Toole announced loudly that Sinatra sang as if burdened with a guilty conscience. Frank attempted to have Peter barred from his favorite establishments in Las Vegas, but O'Toole could not have cared less.
He continued to trail chaos behind him, turning every room Sinatra entered into a stage for his own irreverent triumph. Sinatra despised the British theatrical tradition O'Toole represented, dismissing it as pompous and artificial. O'Toole, in turn, saw in Sinatra nothing more than an insecure kid from New Jersey playing at being a grand boss. To Sinatra, O'Toole symbolized the end of the era of glamorous gangsters. A new breed was rising, rebels who feared neither the mob nor the myth of Frank Sinatra himself. Until the end of his days, Sinatra could not forgive O'Toole for his freedom, nor for the unsettling truth that the British actor seemed cooler without bodyguards, without influence, without the machinery of power. Their feud became legend in Hollywood's nocturnal underworld, a clash of titans in which one fought desperately to defend his throne, while the other simply wanted another drink and the pleasure of toppling whatever took itself too seriously.
Katharine Hepburn versus Glynis Johns. Katharine Hepburn was the living embodiment of American independence, a woman who wore trousers when it was still considered scandalous, whose speech cracked through a room like gunfire, dry, sharp, impeccably precise. She was Hollywood's intellectual conscience, a devotee of athleticism, naturalness, and truth. Any hint of affectation in those around her triggered an almost allergic response. Near the top of her private blacklist of British icons stood Glynis Johns, an actress now widely remembered as Mrs. Banks in Mary Poppins, but during the Golden Age a symbol of the very Victorian coquettishness Hepburn despised. Katharine did not see Glynis merely as a colleague, she saw her as a philosophical threat. Johns trailed behind her a cloud of excessive British good form, something Hepburn considered archaic and faintly humiliating for a modern woman. The irritation began with Glynis's voice, that distinctive husky yet high timbre, which Hepburn publicly described as the squeak of a frightened mouse trapped inside an antique dresser. For Katharine, whose diction was commanding and exact, Johns's tone felt like a calculated attempt to manipulate men through the guise of helpless femininity. Hepburn carried barbed remarks about Glynis into every social gathering, declaring that British actresses arrived in Hollywood not with talent, but with luggage stuffed full of powdered wigs and hypocritical curtsies. To her, Johns embodied everything America was meant to outgrow: submissiveness, mannerism, the performance of fragility. Their feud was quiet but venomous. True to the British school, Glynis Johns never responded openly to Hepburn's bluntness, which only inflamed Hepburn further. She craved a direct clash, an honest collision of opinions, yet encountered nothing but a polite wall of English restraint. "That woman isn't a person, she's custard," Hepburn would murmur acidly when she spotted Johns surrounded by admirers. What infuriated her most was that studio executives continued casting Glynis in roles demanding femininity. In Hepburn's understanding, true femininity meant strength and intellect, not delicate shoulders and fluttering eyelids. The tension sharpened in the 1960s when she sensed old Hollywood flirting with British musical and comedic sensibilities. To Katharine, Glynis Johns became the emblem of a soft invasion, blurring the line between serious dramatic art and light entertainment. Hepburn carried her convictions into every interview, insisting that the American screen did not need British governesses teaching it how to hold the teacup. To her, Glynis was simply another English darling, disguising a lack of deep understanding beneath technical polish and theatrical flourishes. When they found themselves in the same room, Katharine would pointedly discuss politics or stride about with athletic vigor, ignoring Glynis's attempts at polite conversation about the weather or the theater. She regarded Glynis as an ornament of an outdated patriarchal order, while Glynis likely saw in Katharine nothing more than a coarse, ungroomed woman estranged from elegance. The hostility was conceptual as much as personal. Katharine defended a woman's right to be complex, difficult, unapologetic.
Glynis Johns, by her very presence, seemed to prove that the world still preferred women agreeable. Catherine carried that contempt for British sweetness to the end of her days, convinced that actresses like Glynis had set the struggle for female equality in cinema back by decades. For Catherine, it was a war of authenticity against decoration, and she had no intention of lowering her weapons, not even before the most charming smile the United Kingdom could offer.
Marlon Brando versus Alec Guinness. Brando did not come to Hollywood to fit in. He came to detonate it from within, to turn acting from a parade of rehearsed gestures into a raw dissection of the soul. He was the high priest of the method, bringing to the set the smell of sweat, half-mumbled lines, and a frightening animal truth. His collision with Alec Guinness, knight of the British stage and embodiment of technical precision, became nothing less than a war of ideologies. Brando despised everything Guinness represented: cool calculation, immaculate diction, and the ability to slip into a character as neatly as into a tailored suit. To Marlon, Guinness was not a living, breathing artist, but a mechanical doll from a wax museum, capable of imitating emotion without ever feeling it. Brando carried with him an aura of primitive chaos, convinced that only by breaking form could one reach truth, while Guinness believed that form itself was the essence of art. Their conflict sharpened around the very space they occupied. Guinness, who revered discipline and the sanctity of text, was appalled by Brando's habit of rewriting lines on the spot and dragging his personal wounds onto the set. Brando openly mocked Alec's attempts to offer professional advice, dismissing his craft as the work of a robot with gears instead of a heart. He ignored lectures about pauses and accents, insisting that a real actor should grunt if truth demanded a grunt, not recite polished verse with a powdered face. Guinness, for his part, regarded Brando as an uncouth savage and an embarrassment to the profession. What Brando saw as authenticity, Guinness saw as sloppiness, a personal affront to the discipline he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Brando's hostility toward Guinness formed part of his broader rebellion against what he called British theatricality, dead, embalmed, and hollow. In interviews, he emphasized that Guinness was merely a man of 1,000 faces who possessed none of his own. It enraged him that the Brit was celebrated for total transformation because Brando believed an actor must pass a role through his own flesh, not hide behind makeup and prosthetic noses. At one rare joint appearance, Brando behaved with deliberate provocation. He chewed gum while Guinness spoke solemnly about Chekhov, scratched himself at the height of a particularly earnest reflection. To Brando, it was proof that high culture collapsed before the weight of blunt reality. Guinness, in turn, recorded in his diary that Brando was destroying the magic of cinema with his ego and refusal to submit to direction. To Brando, Guinness symbolized the old colonial England still trying to impose its rules on a freer world. Marlon cast himself as the liberator, come to burn those rules to ash. Their feud was a clash of matter and spirit, instinct and intellect. Brando claimed Guinness acted from the head, while he acted from the gut, and between those 2 points there could be no reconciliation. Every success Guinness achieved in America struck Brando as a defeat for American realism. People fall for the British accent, he would say, because they are afraid to look in the mirror at their own grime. Even when Guinness became a cultural icon as Obi-Wan Kenobi, Brando remarked acidly that at last Alec had found a role where he did not have to pretend to be alive. It was a battle over the very nature of acting itself. Brando carried his fury to the end, raging against any hint of British order, seeing in it only chains restraining the human spirit. Guinness remained, in his mind, a great decorator, someone who could arrange the furniture beautifully in a room without air or life, while Brando would rather live among ashes so long as they were real.
Gloria Swanson versus Elizabeth Taylor. Gloria Swanson was not merely an actress, she was the living embodiment of an era when Hollywood was still learning how to be sacred and untouchable. She had reigned over the silent screen, draped in feathers and sable, carrying herself with an undiluted grandeur, forged in a time when a single glance could replace 1,000 words. To her, cinema was religion, and its stars were deities obliged to keep a reverent distance from the crowd. That was why the ascent of Elizabeth Taylor struck her like a personal affront. British-born and blazing into fame at the dawn of a ruthless tabloid age, Taylor represented everything Swanson believed had corrupted the temple. Gloria loathed the way Liz seemed to turn a movie star's life into a public spectacle long before anyone coined the term reality show. In her eyes, Taylor was a brazen British upstart who paraded her romances, her divorces, and those famous violet eyes across the front pages of the world, cheapening the very essence of the profession. For Swanson, Taylor symbolized the triumph of practicality and nerve over mystique. Where once there had been silence and shadow, there were now headlines and diamonds. Gloria would declare with withering pride that in her day they needed no words, they had faces. Of Taylor, she would say that beauty was all surface, that behind it lay emptiness and a troubling lack of discipline. What stung most was the unprecedented $1 million fee Taylor received for Cleopatra, a sum Gloria regarded as vulgar in both scale and implication. To her, it signaled the victory of British commerce over American art. She carried sharp remarks about Taylor's accent, claiming it scraped across American drama like a knife on porcelain whenever Liz ventured into classical roles. At society gatherings, when their paths crossed, Swanson behaved like an empress in exile. She would coolly ignore Taylor's presence, dismissing her as that London girl with an exaggerated sense of her own importance. It infuriated Gloria that Elizabeth dragged Richard Burton in her wake, turning film sets into battlegrounds of ego and desire. Conduct Swanson considered the height of unprofessionalism. In her mind, actresses like Taylor had imported a marketplace spirit into Hollywood, where everything could be bought and sold, reputation, passion, even scandal. Elizabeth Taylor became, in Gloria's private mythology, the iceberg that sank her Titanic, the old, majestic, silent Hollywood she had once commanded. What she could never forgive was that Taylor made stardom accessible. The divine halo, once reserved for distant goddesses, had been lowered to street level. The world, it seemed, preferred violet eyes and headline-grabbing weddings to Swanson's own frozen perfection. Until her final days, Gloria carried that grievance like a relic. She saw in Elizabeth Taylor an invader from the British Isles who had seized the crown only to shatter it into glittering fragments, ornaments fit for a display case at Cartier. To Swanson, this was not a simple changing of the guard. It was art's surrender to spectacle, a capitulation to a brash new order she could neither accept nor forgive.
Drawing a line beneath this parade of mutual hostility and poisoned ambition, it becomes clear that Hollywood's golden age was an era not only of towering achievements, but of profound loneliness, a loneliness that drove its stars to invent enemies where none truly existed. These 10 stories are merely the tip of an iceberg floating in an ocean of professional jealousy, where American bluntness collided with British restraint and sparked conflicts of almost mythic scale. We have seen how the fear of losing a throne compelled figures like Humphrey Bogart and Joan Crawford to carry grudges for decades, turning film sets into battlegrounds of quiet psychological warfare. Hollywood's icons did not resent the British for their accents or their birthplace. They resented them for a different schooling in life and craft, one that threatened their own sense of singularity. It was a clash of cultural codes, the rebellious pulse of young America against the weighty inheritance of old Europe, each convinced it alone guarded the truth. Brando scorned Guinness for his devotion to form. Sinatra bristled at O'Toole's untamed freedom. Monroe paid in tears for Olivier's cold perfectionism. What now reads like vivid footnotes in memoirs once felt to them like a fight for survival in an industry that forgave nothing and tolerated no rival. The deeper tragedy of these icons lay in their pursuit of being the one and only. In that pursuit, they built walls of resentment so high that they sealed themselves off from reality more effectively than any gate in Beverly Hills. Hollywood will forever remain a place where the glare of the spotlights blinds not only the audience, but the gods themselves, forcing them to battle to their final breath the shadows of those who crossed an ocean to share their fragile Olympus.